Welcome to the Louder Than Silence podcast with your host, CG Wagner. This podcast is an extension of our work at LTS to support survivors of sexual violence with long term care, community, and resources, all at no cost to participants. This month's episode is The Wave of Emotion. It was a fairly typical evening, and I milled about in my kitchen getting together my dog's dinner. I was moving a little gingerly because I had gone to Rolfing earlier in the day. In case you've never heard of Rolfing before, it's a type of physical therapy that works on the connective tissues in the body. It's also called structural integration. So I had had a session earlier in the day and was trying to assimilate all the changes that were happening in my body. It felt pretty overwhelming, but not unexpected. My body has held a lot of pain and trauma over the years, so working to release it naturally can be challenging at times. With this, there can also come a release of stored emotions as well. And there I was in my kitchen when the wall of devastating grief hit me. I started sobbing and was doubled over in the sheer agony of the recognition of the pain I had experienced. Not physical pain, though. It was solidly the emotional pain of it all. It took my breath away. And of course, my pups came over to see what was going on, very concerned that I was clearly distressed. And also, if I'm being honest, probably pretty concerned that dinner was delayed. But then, without warning, escaping my lips was saying no on repeat in rapid fire. It was an acknowledgement of all the times I had said no and it was ignored, or the no's that I said that were coerced and manipulated into yeses, or the no's that I said in so many ways but no longer had the fight left in me to hold on to knowing that my no meant something. I sobbed and I wailed. I howled like an animal. I cried so hard that my breath came in gasps. I curled up in a ball in the corner of my kitchen, unable to move or shake the wave of emotions that had knocked me down. As I let all of the pain out, the sobs slowed to tears, which eventually stopped. But I felt entirely wrung out. My energy was totally gone, and all I wanted to do was crawl into bed. The exhaustion ran to the bone. Every part of me was tired, my body, my mind, and my soul. I had experienced grief before, but never something that felt so all encompassing. It was like a balloon had been slowly filling with each painful experience I had in my life to the point of nearly bursting. And then the tiniest hole formed, and all of the power and pressure of everything that had been trapped inside was rushing out. This was the first distinct memory that I could put a finger on where I could see the depth of grief I had for the trauma I had experienced. I had never really considered grief to be part of the healing process. Until this moment, it hadn't been clear. And then, as they say, once you see it, you can't unsee it. I began looking at how the grief that hit me had actually bubbled to the surface during other times in my life, but I didn't know what it was. But it wasn't just the grief that I was blind to, it was also the anger and the shame. Once I started seeing this thread, I couldn't help but keep pulling it. Was I the only one that dealt with these big emotions? Did other survivors experience this too? What did it look like to heal from all of it? This is episode 6 of the Survivors Have Paid Enough series, where we explore 8 areas of health and dive into how survivors of sexual violence have all areas of their lives impacted by the trauma they've experienced. Before we continue on, I want us all to sit with something for just a minute. We are on episode 6 of this series. The episodes are about 25 minutes long. That means that we have already talked about the level of impact on survivors for over 2 hours, not including this episode. We are at over 2 hours already, and we haven't even finished the second of 8 areas of impact. That is an astonishing amount of impact to contemplate. Even I, with as many conversations as I have about this, am shocked to see this trajectory. At this rate, it will be over 10 hours of content explaining the impact sexual violence has on a person. If it takes 10 hours for a person who talks about all of this regularly just to explain it, sit with the question of how much time it takes to undo all of that damage. And this is why this work is so important. That is a devastating amount of impact that survivors are carrying around with them. And this is why, at Louder Than Silence, we firmly believe that survivors have already paid enough. But jumping back in, we started this series by exploring how mental health is affected by sexual violence and taking a deep dive into PTSD. We looked at PTSD itself, but then also had 2 episodes talking about how the symptoms of PTSD impact a survivor's life. We started with the mental health piece of the puzzle because it lays a solid foundation to understand the impact on other areas of health. Last month, we started unpacking how emotional health is impacted by surviving sexual violence. We defined what emotions are and how they are affected by trauma. But for today's episode, we are taking some time exploring the big emotions that many survivors experience, but specifically anger, shame, and grief. And we'll learn what it looks like to sit with these emotional experiences. Let's start by diving into shame a little bit. A great place to start is by differentiating shame and guilt, which is often casually used interchangeably, although they are 2 different things. Shame tells a person that they are bad for existing in the world the way that they are. Guilt means that we did something against our moral code and need to make a shift, and to make amends if our actions have hurt or harmed others. For this conversation, we are exploring shame, the messaging that we are not good enough as we exist. So, how is that connected to surviving sexual violence? Well, as we've mentioned several times in this podcast, but it's worth saying again, nearly 80% of survivors of sexual violence know the perpetrator. This means that they have had contact with the person before and have some sort of additional connection points to them. For the survivors who know the person who harmed them, it's generally a slow build of grooming that happens. It's a combination of manipulation, control, gaslighting, and weaponizing shame that undermines a person's autonomy and their ability to make decisions for themselves. When the person experiencing abuse pushes back against something that the perpetrator does, it's shame that forces them back in line. In a healthy relationship, if a person does something that hurts the other person, the conversation is about that behavior and how to create a different dynamic moving forward. In grooming and abusive dynamics, if the person being abused does something that the perpetrator doesn't like, they are shamed for it, told that who they are as a person is inherently bad, wrong, misguided, etc. When steeped in this dynamic long enough, the survivor's life revolves around trying to avoid the emotional outburst from the perpetrator and the ensuing shame connected to it. So, the natural next step is that the person internalizes that pattern of harm to keep themselves on the straight and narrow, so to speak, in order to avoid the abuse as much as possible. It then simply just becomes the way of life. I've recently started hearing more about the concept of so-called positive shame, and I want to go ahead and nip that in the bud right away. Shame tells a person that who they are is less than others and needs to be controlled in order to be acceptable. That's not ever going to be helpful. Yes, of course, there are behaviors that we want to improve or to change, and that makes sense. But behaviors are not the person. A person has inherent value, dignity, and worth. Undermining that will always cause damage, even if it's framed as being somehow positive because the person eventually changes. The person may, in fact, change, but distance themselves from who they are in the process. And that's not helpful or healthy in the long run. Many people struggle to identify shame and how it manifests. Shame is the sense of feeling that if you're truly seen by another person, you kind of want to just crawl into a hole. It's a sense that if people knew the real you, they would reject you. It's the form of self talk that is generally called negative self talk, insulting yourself, being cruel to yourself, or saying things to yourself in order to feel the pain somehow deserved by the bad behavior. There's a feeling of never being comfortable in your own skin because clearly there's something wrong with you at all points in time that needs to be fixed. So, for people in abusive situations, they are often hearing overtly negative messages about who they are from someone else and from themselves at the same time. And that is painful. And there's no clear outlet for that pain. So, most people in that situation just keep pushing it down and bottling it up as the person has to distance themselves from what's happening to them and within them. The shame piles up more and more until it eventually leaks out. And this leads us pretty naturally into addressing anger. As the shame begins to surface, there can also be space for feeling our anger. Anger is the response we have when someone or something we value has been harmed. It says, no, this can't go on. When we experience anger about how someone has been treated, it's actually an expression of love. It demonstrates to someone that who they are is precious. It shows when connections between people have been damaged. It points to something much bigger than whatever is happening in that exact moment. Survivors of sexual violence and other long-term abuse have had our value chipped away at by our abusers. So the concept of being angry for how we are treated often feels like a foreign concept. If we don't know that we have value, we don't know that it's okay to believe that our anger is actually coming from a good place. But we can more easily recognize someone else's value, which is why feeling angry on behalf of someone we love is much, much easier. And as we heal, we start to see how we were treated, just how incredibly destructive it was. As we undo the damaging messages that we have been steeped in, the anger often bubbles to the surface with it. As we work through the shame, anger comes in to point us to the fact that we should never have been treated that way in the first place. That being said, there is a caveat. It is tragically common for rage to be described as anger, even though they are entirely two different things. Rage is reactive, it is destructive, and it's violent. It is often based in enacting out the person's own shame or some form of entitlement. It is biting, it is stinging, and it is vindictive. Anger is a thoughtful response, inspiring change and healthy action. It is based in love and in justice. It is inspiring and is life-giving. When we allow ourselves to address anger in a healthy way, it drives healthy and positive action. It lights a fire for us, allowing the flame to grow steadily, but not explode. It shines a light to say, something's not right here. We can use anger as a guide, a way to point to our true north and to see what's happening in our lives with clarity. And as most of us have experienced, anger runs hot. Even when we feel it, we start to sweat and our face flushes. It's one of the primary emotions that inspires action. But what happens when that heat runs out? What happens when we burn through that excess energy and are left sifting through the emotions that are underneath it? This is often when the grief sets in. As survivors, there are so many things to grieve: the loss of a sense of safety, the loss of trust, the loss of connection. We see the shame that we experienced and feel the burn of the questions around why we had to live through such terrible things. We ponder if life will ever feel good again. But really, the grief is coming to terms with the loss of what could have never been. The relationship that we thought was a good one, only to realize it was abusive all along. The family dynamics that told us our family was doing all the things the right way, only to see how damaging it was when unpacking it all later in life. It can be found in work situations and friendships and the communities that we are in. It starts to become clear that the way our lives were structured allowed for the abuse to happen and to continue. This means that the people we thought we could count on actually couldn't be trusted, or that the job we thought was great was actually causing us more pain, or the friendship that we thought was our lifeline was only perpetuating unhealthy dynamics. Many survivors start to see with clarity that their entire lives look different than they thought they did. Of course, in healing, we get to address all of this and point ourselves in the direction of the lives we want. But first, we have to wander through the land of grieving. We grieve that we can never have a life that is free from what we experienced in the past. We will be forever affected by the wounds we received. Now, can wounds heal in time? Of course. But first, we have to be willing to sit with the understanding that the wounds are real and they are deep. And this is a heart-wrenching process. And if grieving doesn't feel like the right way to describe it, find a way that does. Ugly cry, wail, moan, howl. Cover yourself with sackcloth and ash. Mourn. In whatever way it resonates with you, find a way to let out the pain. As I shared at the beginning of the podcast, these emotions can totally catch you off guard and feel like too much to bear sometimes. So, how do we handle working through all of these big emotions? First, remember the Shannon Alder quote: feelings are something you have, not something you are. Just because you're feeling something one moment doesn't mean that you will have to change anything about who you are. It just allows the awareness to come to how we want to be in any particular moment. And as we begin to address our feelings, we should first ask ourselves what we can handle and what will challenge our window of tolerance. Being self aware is our first step in healing. What emotions are you ready to face? Which are too big and need to be addressed later, or only in part? This is your path toward healing. Only you know what feels manageable at this point. Once we are ready to sit in our emotions, then we can look for their connections to our patterns and environment. Facing this process with the help of a therapist, specifically an EMDR therapist, is highly recommended. Having a person with trauma-specific training guiding you on the journey will make it an easier one. But beyond having a therapist, we all need people in our lives we can count on. Have your go-to people who understand what you are going through in this healing process and, importantly, have space for it themselves. Lean on them when the emotions arise. It's crucial that these people are emotionally healthy themselves. Trying to rely on emotionally unhealthy people will eventually hurt you more. But the healthy people in our lives, they can help you stay above the surface when the wave comes. And the waves will come. Something will cause a release of a certain emotion, and it will bubble up. The wave can be big, very big. The key to all of this is staying curious, approaching yourself with grace, and being willing to feel what's happening when it is the right time. Keep checking in with yourself to know if you're in the window of tolerance or if you need some help. Explore what a healthy expression of that emotion looks like in that moment. And through it all, remember, you don't have to handle it all perfectly. It will be messy and uncomfortable. Be kind to yourself as you create these new patterns. There will be times that you feel blindsided by an emotion. Keep tabs on when that happens to see where the patterns emerge, and then make a plan. Remember, it is uncomfortable to sit with a feeling that we were numb to for so long. It will likely feel that you are doing something wrong or bad, or that you're going to cause yourself more problems by feeling it. Keep in mind that there's no moral implication of feeling a particular thing. Emotions are just a guide to give us clarity about our experiences and to help point us in the right direction. It might be easier to assume that continuing to shut down the emotions and bottle them up is better. It certainly feels less intense in the moment. But just know that pretending any emotion doesn't exist as a long-term strategy will eventually fail. It's inevitable. Ignoring our emotions is an unhealthy coping mechanism that helped us at one point in time, but eventually cause us harm when we leave them unacknowledged. One of the books I often mention doing this work is The Body Keeps the Score. And trust me, your body is keeping the score. Your body is keeping tabs on when you release the emotions and when you bottle them up. Bottling them up will cause more issues down the road. The shame, anger, and grief will come as you do your healing work. It can feel like a lot, but you can trust yourself in this process, and you have the ability to take steps forward in facing your big emotions. With each wave you face, more of the emotional energy is released, and the next wave is smaller. Each time the shame, anger, and grief arise, know that you are on the right path, that this is what progress looks like. Each time they visit you, it's letting go of what has been stored for so long, and that is exactly what you need to heal. Eventually, you will look back and realize the waves no longer come, that the emotions don't feel so big, that you have moved forward in your life. You are not broken. This is a normal response to dealing with trauma. The emotions can be big because what you experienced was huge, but you don't have to keep living there either. Keep doing the work. One day you will find that the waves you were once so afraid of are a distant memory, and you are able to lay back and float in the peacefulness that surrounds you. I believe this can be true for each of you listening. And if you're a survivor who needs help getting there, please reach out to us. We would love to swim in those waters with you. And thank you for listening to the Louder Than Silence podcast. If you'd like more information about our organization, visit us at louderthansilence.org and sign up for our newsletter or follow us on Instagram at louderthansilence.org. If you like our work, please consider donating today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast for the most current episodes. See you next month.